Imagine standing in the resplendent marble corridor of a Roman villa. The sunset bathes vibrant frescoes in a soft golden light. A flickering oil lamp casts long shadows, making the gods and heroes on the walls seem to dance in the wavering glow. Through a sheer curtain, you can just make out the murmurs of a noblewoman and her attendants as they discuss tomorrow's beauty rituals. The air is heavy with the scent of roses and frankincense, and yet there's another faint, almost metallic tang beneath it all, something sharp, cold, and deeply mysterious. A senator's wife emerges, her face as pale as a statue, coated in a fine powder of toxic lead. Her lips are a vivid red, stained with a rouge made from mercury, substances that are, molecule by molecule, silently eroding her body from within. She glides toward a study where powerful guests await, each step graceful, yet weighed down by the alien pressures of her world. This was the reality of ancient Rome, a place where intimacy was intertwined with power, and where beauty so often blended with suffering. How did these rituals truly shape its people? And what might they reveal about us today? Before we journey into these forgotten truths, if you find value in exploring the quiet corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. I always love to hear where our stories reach, so feel free to leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. To begin to understand this world, we must travel to the year 79 AD. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it buried the bustling city of Pompeii under a thick blanket of volcanic ash. In a single, terrible day, it created a time capsule. It preserved not just buildings and bodies, but startling evidence of intimate practices that the Romans themselves often discussed only in whispers. Archaeological excavations there have revealed bedrooms with astonishingly explicit frescoes, bathhouses with their own intricate social codes, and private spaces where the lines between pleasure, pain, and power blurred beyond all recognition. This frozen moment in time allows us to explore concepts that were central to the Roman identity, yet feel deeply foreign to us. Consider the idea of pudicitia, a word we might translate as chastity or modesty, but which encompassed something far more complex and demanding. For a Roman woman of the upper classes, pudicitia was not simply about personal virtue or sexual purity. It was a performance. It was about maintaining the precise balance of availability and restraint that her social position required. She had to be sexually available to her husband to produce heirs, while remaining utterly inaccessible to all other men. This wasn't a matter of personal choice. It was a public reflection of her husband's honour and his political standing. Her body was a symbol of his control. No one understood or mastered this delicate performance better than Livia, the wife of the first Roman emperor Augustus. For over 50 years, she was the absolute model of Roman feminine virtue, a living embodiment of pudicitia. Yet, historical whispers suggest that behind this flawless public facade, she was one of the most powerful political operators in Rome. It was alleged that she maintained a vast network of informants, gathering intelligence from the slave girls in the households of prominent families. She understood that in the Roman world, personal information was political currency. The secrets of the bedchamber, the arguments between a husband and wife, a hidden illness, these were weapons, and Livia, it seems, wielded them with unmatched skill. This highlights a fundamental truth about Roman society. Marriage itself operated on principles that seem almost businesslike in their cold calculation. Among the elite, marriages were not unions of the heart. They were negotiations between families, designed to consolidate wealth, forge political alliances, and most importantly produce legitimate heirs to carry on the family name and fortune. Love, if it happened to develop, was seen as a pleasant and fortunate bonus, but never a prerequisite. For many young couples, their wedding night was the first time they were truly alone together. Imagine the pressure of that moment. The historian Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to a friend in 97 AD, describing the wedding of a young girl from a prominent family. She was only 14 years old, and he describes her trembling as her mother and aunts prepared her for the ceremony. A single evening that would transform her into a wife. Her husband, a man 20 years her senior whom she barely knew, waited in the next room. Meanwhile, older women explained duties to her that she could hardly comprehend. The marriage bed had been blessed by the household gods, sprinkled with holy water, and draped with fabrics dyed a specific shade of red. This was not for romance. It was to conceal the evidence of her painful first intimacy, the final act in a day of terrifying transition. This system of control was built upon a rigid pyramid of power. Roman society recognized distinct categories of human beings, and these categories determined not just your social status, but your sexual role. Citizens, non-citizens, slaves, former slaves, and foreigners all occupied different rungs on this ladder. A Roman citizen man could engage in sexual relationships with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without any social criticism. It was expected. But his interactions with the wives or daughters of other Roman citizens were strictly and dangerously regulated. A man named Gaius Silius discovered this distinction in the most fatal way possible. In 48 AD, he participated in a marriage ceremony with Valeria Messalina, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, while the emperor was away from Rome. Whether this was a drunken joke, a political plot, or a genuine affair, we will never know. But the legality of the marriage mattered less than its symbolic challenge to imperial authority. By touching the emperor's wife, Silius had trespassed on the emperor's power. When Claudius returned, both Silius and Messalina were immediately executed. Their crime was not truly adultery. It was for threatening the political order through a profoundly personal act. And at the very bottom of this pyramid were the slaves, whose existence added another layer of unimaginable complexity to Roman intimate life. Household slaves were not considered people under the law. They were property, extensions of their owner's body, and they were available for sexual use without consent and without any legal protection. Wealthy Romans often maintained specialized slaves for every aspect of intimate life: hairdressers, makeup artists, and what were known as cubiculari, slaves designated for bedroom service. One of Rome's wealthiest men, Marcus Crassus, reportedly owned more than 500 slaves in his city home alone. Among them were dozens of young men and women selected purely for their physical beauty. Roman writers of the time hinted at elaborate rituals within these great houses, evening gatherings where slaves would perform not just music and poetry, but intimate services that blurred the line between entertainment, worship, and exploitation, creating a world of intimacy built not on emotion, but on absolute and often brutal power. The Roman obsession with status and control extended from the political chamber and the marriage contract directly onto the human body itself. This control was practiced and displayed in one of the most important institutions of Roman life, the public bathhouse. These were not simply places to get clean. The grandest of them were sprawling complexes of marble and mosaic, serving as community centres, gymnasiums, art galleries, and social hubs. But they also functioned as venues for more private encounters, ranging from subtle flirtation to explicit propositions. While men and women typically bathed in separate facilities or at different times, the social mixing that occurred in the libraries, gardens, and exercise yards often led to arrangements that would be concluded later, in private. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, writing around 60 AD, gives us an unfiltered audio recording of this world. He famously complained about the constant noise coming from a bathhouse directly beneath his apartment. He describes the grunting of men lifting weights, the sharp slap of the masseur's hands on flesh, the high-pitched yelps of those having their armpit hair plucked with tweezers, and underneath it all a constant hum of whispered negotiations between the bathers and attendants, who offered services not advertised on any public notice. Seneca's irritation reveals a world where commercial sex was so deeply integrated into daily life that it operated openly within public institutions. His complaint is a window into a culture with a profoundly different sense of privacy. The sounds of bodies being exercised, cleaned, and even serviced were simply part of the city's background noise. It was in this public-private space that the Roman body was disciplined and perfected according to strict cultural standards, and few standards were stricter than the demand for a hairless body. This practice, what we would call depilation, bordered on a cultural obsession, particularly among the upper classes. For both men and women of status, a smooth, hairless body was a sign of refinement and civilization. But the methods used to achieve this ideal were often excruciating. They included heated bronze tweezers, primitive waxes made from sticky pine resin, and even pumice stones, which were used to literally abrade the hair from the skin. Wealthy Romans didn't even have to perform this painful task themselves. They employed specialized slaves called ellipilari, whose sole responsibility was hair removal. Imagine this strange and terrible job: to be the person who carefully, methodically, inflicts pain on your owner as a part of their daily routine. The poet Martial, a Spaniard who became a keen observer of Roman life, described watching a senator's wife endure a depilation session. He paints a haunting picture. She lies perfectly motionless as her slave girl works with the heated tweezers, plucking each individual hair from her arms, her legs, and more intimate areas. The woman maintains the stoic, impassive expression expected of a Roman matron, but silent tears run down her cheeks. She makes no sound that might suggest weakness or complaint, because to do so would be undignified. The procedure took hours. When it was finally over, her skin was raw and bleeding, but it was perfectly smooth, the texture demanded by the fashion of her social position. This painful ritual was, at its core, another performance of status. It signalled that her body did no labour. It was a canvas, a decorative object, one whose perfection was achieved through suffering that she was wealthy enough to command and strong enough to endure. After the body was cleansed and smoothed, it was then painted, and the cosmetics used in ancient Rome often contained substances we now know to be deadly. The most desired look for an upper-class woman was a pale, almost ghostly complexion. This was a crucial status symbol, as it proved she did not have to work outdoors in the sun. To achieve this, women applied a thick paste made from lead carbonate, a substance known as cerussa. While it gave them the fashionable pallor they desired, prolonged use led inevitably to lead poisoning. It caused neurological damage, infertility, decay of the teeth and bones, and eventually a slow and agonizing death. The vibrant colours were just as dangerous. Rouge and lip stains were often made from cinnabar, a mercury-based compound. It produced a beautiful, lasting crimson hue while slowly destroying the user's nervous system. The dramatic dark coal eyeliner that defined their eyes often contained antimony and other toxic heavy metals. The poet Ovid, in his famous work Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, provided women with detailed instructions for their beauty routines. Read today, they sound less like makeup tips and more like recipes for a gradual self-inflicted demise. He instructs, mix white lead with vinegar until it forms a smooth paste, then apply thickly to the face and neck. For lips, he suggests crushing cinnabar with rose oil and animal fat. Women who followed these instructions were, quite literally, painting themselves to death over the course of years or decades. They were pursuing an ideal of beauty that demanded the ultimate sacrifice of their health and longevity. They were not simply decorating their faces, they were embodying their family's wealth and status. Each layer of a lead paste was a declaration of privilege, a testament to a life lived indoors, away from the toil of the common people. It was a mask of nobility, and the price of that mask was a poisoned body. For Roman women, the body was not just a canvas for beauty, it was the site of their most critical social duty, procreation. A successful marriage was one that produced legitimate heirs, preferably sons, to continue the family line and inherit its wealth. This immense pressure to conceive, or in many cases to avoid conception, led women down paths that were fraught with danger. Roman contraceptive and abortifacient practices relied on a terrifying blend of folk knowledge, misunderstood medicine, and highly toxic substances. The search for a reliable contraceptive was a desperate one. One of the most famous and sought-after methods was a plant called silphium. This mysterious herb grew only along a small stretch of the coast of modern-day Libya, and was so valued for its contraceptive properties that it was harvested to extinction. The plant's image was minted on the coins of the nearby city of Cyrene, and it was said to have sold for its weight in silver. Women consumed it in various preparations, but the plant's active compounds were so potent that an overdose frequently proved fatal. In their quest to control their fertility, women gambled with their lives for a plant that promised freedom, but often delivered death. A Greek physician named Soranus of Ephesus, who practiced in Rome during the 2nd century AD, documented other contraceptive methods in his work, Gynecology. His clinical, detached tone does little to mask the desperation of the women he describes. Some, he writes, would insert pessaries made of wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or acidic vinegar before intercourse. Others would consume dangerous mixtures of copper sulfate, iron rust, or even crushed beetles, hoping some unknown property would prevent a pregnancy. Still others attempted to dislodge a potential conception through violent exercise, shockingly hot baths, or even deliberate staged falls. These were not the actions of women with safe choices. They were the actions of women risking everything to exert some measure of control over their own bodies, in a society that offered them few legal or social alternatives. If contraception failed, the next step was abortion, a practice that was even more perilous. Roman law generally permitted abortion, viewing the fetus not as a separate legal entity, but as part of the mother's body. The decision was the father's to make. However, the procedures available were brutal and frequently lethal for the woman. There were two primary methods: poisons and instruments. Women would consume toxic plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savin, which were known to induce miscarriages. But they worked by poisoning the woman's entire system, causing violent convulsions, organ failure, and often death. If the herbal route failed, a woman might resort to a mechanical procedure. These were performed with long bronze instruments that were inserted into the womb. In an age before sanitation and antibiotics, the risk of hemorrhage, internal injury, and overwhelming infection was incredibly high. The historian Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic work Natural History, described observing a wealthy woman's attempt to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. His account is chilling. She had consumed various herbs for days, growing weaker and more desperate with each passing hour. Finally, she submitted to a Greek physician who used bronze instruments to perform the procedure. Pliny tells us she bit down hard on a leather strap to stifle her screams, while her female relatives physically held her still on the bed. The procedure was successful in ending the pregnancy, but infection set in within days. She died in agony. To preserve the family's honour, they told their neighbours she had succumbed to a sudden fever, never admitting the true cause of her death. Her story, a quiet tragedy hidden behind a wall of social shame, was likely one of thousands. These life and death struggles were the dark side of the rituals that began on the wedding night. For the upper classes, a wedding was a meticulously choreographed event, steeped in tradition and symbolism designed to ensure fertility and marital harmony. Before the bride entered her new home, she was physically lifted and carried across the threshold. This was done to prevent evil spirits from entering the house through the soles of her feet. In a particularly stark ritual, her hair was parted using a spear that had been used to kill a gladiator, a symbol meant to imbue her with the courage she would need to survive childbirth. The marriage bed itself was blessed by matrons who had only been married once and had living children, their own lives serving as a good omen. Meanwhile, young boys scattered nuts and fruits, ancient symbols of fertility. The poet Catullus, in a wedding song from around 60 BC, captures the terror and ceremony of the moment. He describes the young bride sitting silently as older women remove her childhood clothes and dress her in the saffron-coloured gown of a wife. Her face is painted with sacred clay, her hair bound with ribbons blessed by the household gods. Catullus notes that she weeps, not from sadness, but from pure terror of the unknown transformation that awaits her. In the next room, her groom waits, drinking wine with his male relatives, who offer him advice that is both crude and tender about the duties he must perform before the sun rises. The night was not about love or discovery. It was a ritualized high-stakes performance, upon which the future of two families depended. While marriage formed the bedrock of Roman society, a vast and complex world of desire existed beyond its formal boundaries. Roman attitudes toward relationships between men, for example, operated according to a social code that had very little to do with modern concepts of sexual orientation and everything to do with power. For the Romans, it was not the gender of one's partner that mattered, but the role one took. Sexual relationships between men were acceptable, and often even celebrated, provided they respected the rigid hierarchies of Roman life. A Roman citizen could take the active, dominant role with slaves, foreigners, or social inferiors without any criticism. This was seen as a natural expression of his status and authority. However, to willingly take the passive role, to be penetrated by another man, was considered deeply shameful, a stain on one's character that could have serious social and political consequences. To be penetrated was to be symbolically transformed into a lower status being, a slave, a foreigner, or a woman. It was an abdication of one's masculinity and fitness to rule. No one understood the danger of this accusation better than Julius Caesar. Throughout his entire career, he was hounded by persistent rumours about an alleged passive relationship he had with King Nicomedes of Bithynia during his youth. His political enemies never let him forget it. They mockingly referred to him as the Queen of Bithynia, and every time he stood to speak in the Senate, they would make crude jokes. The accusations were a powerful political weapon, suggesting that a man who'd been sexually dominated was unfit to command armies and govern the Republic. Whether the rumours were true mattered far less than their power to damage his reputation in a culture where sexual dominance and political authority were inextricably linked. Generations later, the Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the beautiful Greek youth, Antinous, would scandalise many Romans for a different reason. The issue was not that Hadrian loved a young man. The problem was the depth of his emotional attachment. Hadrian's obvious and overwhelming love suggested that he, the emperor, had surrendered the dominant position. When Antinous tragically drowned in the Nile River in 130 AD, Hadrian's grief was inconsolable. It was seen as profoundly undignified for a Roman ruler. He wept openly, wrote poetry, and, most shocking of all, he deified the young man, founding a city in his honour. To many Stoic-minded Romans, these were not the acts of a powerful emperor, but of a man weakened and controlled by romantic passion. If private passions were governed by unwritten codes of power, public sexuality was a legally recognised and regulated industry. Prostitution operated within a formal framework that acknowledged different categories of sex workers, each with varying rights and social positions. There were the meretrices, registered prostitutes who worked in brothels, or lupanaria, and paid taxes on their earnings. Below them were the ancillae, slave women whose owners rented out their sexual services. And then there were the famousae, women of higher social classes who had lost their respectability through scandals like adultery, and had fallen into informal prostitution to survive. The brothels of Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic ash, give us a hauntingly clear picture of the working conditions for these women. The rooms were often tiny, windowless stone cubicles, barely large enough for a narrow masonry bed. On the walls above, explicit frescoes depicted various sexual acts, sometimes with prices listed next to them, like a menu, and scratched into the plaster are graffiti left by clients, names, crude reviews of the service, and then, every so often, something that cuts through the centuries. One inscription reads, "Restituta, you have such a sweet way of moving your hips." It is a small, startling flicker of human connection and genuine affection in the most commercial of settings. The largest concentration of these establishments was in Rome's infamous Subura district, a chaotic, vibrant neighbourhood of taverns, gambling dens and brothels. The historian Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, described a sight that revealed the deep hypocrisy of the Roman elite. He wrote of wealthy men, senators and even priests frequenting these places. They would arrive after dark, their fine togas exchanged for the rough tunics of the common folk, their faces covered and their senatorial rings hidden away in purses. By dawn, they would return to their grand villas and their public duties, seamlessly reassuming their roles as pillars of Roman virtue, as if the night's activities had occurred in another reality. This stark divide between public virtue and private behaviour was also evident in Roman divorce laws. Among the upper classes, a marriage could be ended by either the husband or the wife with a simple declaration. But the consequences of that declaration varied dramatically by gender. A man who divorced his wife faced few, if any, social or financial penalties, and could remarry immediately. But a woman who initiated or was subjected to a divorce often faced social ostracism, the loss of her children who legally belonged to her husband's family, and significant financial hardship. Emperor Augustus, in a bid to restore what he saw as declining Roman morals, tried to regulate this behaviour with his Lex Julia laws in 18 BC. These laws required elite men to marry, penalised those who remained bachelors, and placed heavy sanctions on adultery. The law backfired spectacularly. It created a black market in fake marriages, as wealthy Romans found ever more creative ways to satisfy the letter of the law while ignoring its spirit. Some men would marry one of their own slave women, only to free her immediately after. Others arranged marriages with foreigners living in distant provinces, women they would never meet, just to avoid the bachelor tax. It was a clear sign that not even the absolute power of an emperor could legislate the desires of the human heart. It would be easy, looking at these rigid contracts and cold calculations, to believe that the Romans were strangers to the powerful emotions that we associate with love. It is tempting to see their world as one governed only by power and duty. But to do so would be to miss the vibrant, chaotic and deeply human heart that beat just beneath the surface of their Stoic society. The evidence is there, in passionate poems and public displays of grief, that Romans experienced the same intense emotions that have characterized human relationships across all of history. Their struggle was in reconciling these feelings with the unforgiving social structures they inhabited. Perhaps no one captured this conflict more vividly than the poet Catullus. In the 1st century BC, he wrote a series of searingly personal poems about his tumultuous love affair with a woman he called Lesbia. Historians widely believe Lesbia was in fact Clodia Metelli, the brilliant, beautiful, and very married sister of a prominent politician. Catullus's poems are a journey through the ecstasy and agony of a forbidden love. He describes moments of breathtaking tenderness and joy, writing, "Let us live, my Lesbia, and let us love. Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100, then another 1,000. In these lines we see that despite all the social conventions, genuine, passionate love could and did flourish. But when the relationship soured, Catullus's language turned as violent and cruel as it had once been tender. He attacks Lesbia with vicious misogynistic language, threatening her and her other lovers with brutal acts of sexual domination. This shocking turn reveals the dark underside of Roman passion. For Catullus, love and power were so deeply intertwined that when he lost his emotional hold on Lesbia, he instinctively reverted to the language of social and sexual power. It was his way of reclaiming the dominance he felt he had lost, using the ugliest words as a weapon against his own emotional injury. This raw, untamable emotion also found a sanctioned outlet in the realm of religion. Roman religious festivals often included elements that modern audiences would find shocking, creating a space where the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended. The most famous of these was the Floralia, a festival celebrated each April in honour of the goddess Flora, a deity of flowers, spring and fertility. The celebrations featured theatrical performances with graphically sexual content, and dancers, often prostitutes, who would perform completely nude. The festival would culminate in acts of public coupling, which were believed to encourage agricultural abundance for the coming year. The historian Martial described attending the Floralia in 88 AD. He noted with cynical amusement how the theatre filled with citizens who would loudly condemn such displays in their private homes, but who now cheered wildly. Senators sat beside slaves, all pretending that it was religious duty, rather than simple curiosity, that had brought them to witness the spectacle. The goddess Flora, it was said, blessed those who honoured her with a complete abandonment of modesty. The festival acted as a social pressure valve, a moment of sanctioned chaos that allowed the rigid structures of Roman society to bend without breaking. This deep connection between the spiritual, the emotional and the physical also profoundly influenced Roman medicine. Physicians like Galen and Soranus wrote detailed descriptions of human anatomy and sexual function, but their recommendations often reflected cultural assumptions about gender and power more than pure science. They believed, for instance, that it was necessary for a woman to experience sexual pleasure in order to conceive a child, yet they also warned that excessive pleasure could make her immoral, uncontrollable, and a danger to the social order. Soranus of Ephesus, in his Guide for Midwives, reveals just how intertwined these ideas were. He advises that if a woman's labour is proceeding slowly, the midwife should ask if she achieved satisfaction during the act of conception. The logic was that pleasure opens the womb and encourages the child's descent. He goes on to state that women who conceive through force or a sense of marital duty often have difficult, painful labours, while those who conceive in a moment of mutual passion deliver their children more easily. In this belief, we see a fascinating blend of practical observation and moral judgment. A woman's physical suffering in childbirth was seen as a direct consequence of her emotional state during conception. This placed Roman women in an impossible position, a psychological tightrope they had to walk every day. They were trapped between two contradictory expectations. The poet Ovid captured this dilemma perfectly. He described lying with a lover who performed her wifely duty like a beautiful cold statue, showing no pleasure for fear that any display of passion might mark her as wanton and immoral. Yet, Ovid writes, when he ceased his efforts, she began to weep, believing her coldness had displeased him, and that she had failed in her duty to be desirable. Roman wives, he concluded, had to navigate between the monster of excessive desire and the whirlpool of insufficient response. It is a heartbreaking image, one that reveals the deep anxiety created by a culture that simultaneously demanded and condemned female passion, leaving many women to wreck upon one shore or the other. The intimate lives of Romans were not merely a private affair, they were a fundamental part of the engine that powered the empire. The desires, fears, and relationships of individuals were systematically harnessed, taxed, and legislated to serve the interests of the state. This transformation of the personal into the political is nowhere more chillingly clear than in the Roman approach to slavery. Beyond the use of individual slaves for pleasure, some large agricultural estates, or latifundia, maintained detailed records of what can only be described as human breeding programs. These records, preserved on papyrus scraps and wax tablets, read with the disturbing detachment of livestock inventories. They were designed to produce children with specific desirable traits: strength for field labour, beauty for domestic service, or intelligence for administrative roles. Slave women were forced into unions based on their master's economic calculations. Children born from these unions legally belonged to the master, regardless of who the father was, creating families that could be, and often were, torn apart and sold at a moment's notice. This level of control, reducing human beings to mere assets, reveals how completely Roman society had dehumanized the people they enslaved. Pliny the Younger, a man we often think of as one of Rome's more humane figures, wrote a letter to a friend that exposes the emotional paradoxes of this system. He mourns the passing of his slave, Zosimus, writing, "He was more than a servant to me. He was a companion who shared my bed, my meals, and my confidences." He speaks of nursing the man himself and being left with an emptiness in his household. Yet, in the same breath, he must acknowledge the social transgression of his own grief. He arranged for a tomb that named Zosimus as his beloved friend rather than his property, knowing full well, as he wrote, that some will consider this excessive sentiment for a mere slave. Even in profound grief, the rigid hierarchy of master and property could not be forgotten. Where legal and social systems failed to provide control, many Romans turned to the supernatural. Archaeological sites across the former empire have yielded thousands of what are known as curse tablets. These were thin sheets of lead, inscribed with magical formulas, then folded, pierced with a nail, and often deposited in graves or sacred springs. A remarkable number of them are requests for divine intervention in romantic or sexual matters. They are raw, desperate cries for control over the human heart. One reads, "I bind Gaius Lucius, so that he can think of nothing but Claudia, so that he cannot eat or sleep or find peace until he comes to her bed." People also consumed love potions made from a myriad of strange animal and plant ingredients, sold in the marketplaces despite being illegal. In ancient Rome, the line between medicine, magic, and poison was often dangerously thin. This impulse to control and dominate was a driving force not just in personal relationships, but in military conquest as well. Roman military culture, while officially demanding celibacy from its soldiers on campaign, operated with a brutal pragmatism. The systematic rape of captured women was not seen as a war crime, but as a natural rite of conquest, part of the soldier's payment. Caesar himself, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, hints at this practice with chilling brevity. After the great victory at the Siege of Alesia, he writes that the legions celebrated their victory according to ancient custom. The captured women, he notes, were distributed among the officers and men, some to serve as servants, others for purposes that military discipline usually forbade, but victory temporarily permitted. He describes the sounds from the camp that night as a mingling of triumphal songs and screams, a terrible music that, for Caesar, spoke of Rome's dual nature as both a force of civilization and of utter destruction. Back in Rome, the state found a more mundane way to profit from sex: taxation. Sexual commerce was a legitimate and significant source of income for the imperial treasury. Registered prostitutes paid licensing fees and taxes on their earnings. Brothel owners paid property taxes on their establishments. Even private citizens caught in adultery faced heavy financial penalties that went directly to the state. Sex was not just a private matter or a moral issue in Rome. It was a regulated industry, and the empire had a direct financial interest in ensuring that it continued to thrive. The very structure of Roman cities reflected these built-in assumptions about sexuality and power. Public buildings had separate entrances and spaces for men and women. Private homes were meticulously designed with a clear hierarchy of rooms, from the public reception areas to the innermost chambers, the cubicula, where sexual activity occurred. And the roads, those famous marvels of Roman engineering, did more than move armies and goods. They served as arteries for sexual commerce, allowing prostitutes, entertainers, and slaves to travel easily between cities, following the flow of soldiers, festivals, and money. A travelling merchant on the Appian Way would expect to find sexual services at a roadside inn as readily as he would find a meal and a bed for the night. It was all simply part of the imperial infrastructure, a system built on flesh and coin, where the most intimate aspects of human life were harnessed to serve the grand project of Roman power. Now picture yourself back in that marble corridor where our journey began. But this time, it is different. The air is still scented with rose oil and incense, but you understand what that strange metallic undertone really is. It is the scent of lead-based makeup, the slow, sweet poison of beauty. You hear the whispers from behind the curtain not as idle chatter, but as the planning of a performance, the careful calibration of a wife's duty. You now see the senator's wife not just as an elegant figure, but as a woman navigating a world of impossible expectations. Her marriage is a contract, her body a political symbol, and her beauty a mask that may cost her her life. The slaves who follow her are not just servants, they are property, their bodies and their children belonging to another, their own intimate lives existing only at the whim of their owner. Roman civilization gave us roads, laws, literature, and architectural marvels that still inspire awe today. But as we have seen, it also created systems of human intimacy built on foundations of inequality, exploitation, and violence that we struggle to comprehend. The Romans were not monsters. They were human beings, operating within a cultural framework that seemed as natural and inevitable to them as our own customs seem to us. The volcanic ash that preserved Pompeii did more than freeze a city in time. It preserved a mirror. When we look into it, it reflects back uncomfortable truths, reminding us that the distance between their world and ours might be smaller than we'd like to believe. We have simply become more sophisticated at hiding the transactions, the inequalities, and the power imbalances that still shape our most private moments. Their ghosts whisper to us from across the centuries, not in Latin, but in the universal language of human desire, forever complicated by human cruelty. They remind us that intimacy has never been innocent, that love has never been free from power, and that every culture's most private customs reveal its deepest values about who counts as fully human and who does not. Standing in those ruins today, you can almost hear the echo of those ancient whispers, carrying secrets that were buried, but never truly died.